So our story today, we have yet another story out of Mark where we're going, how could they? How could they possibly have done this? This young man in white tells them this wonderful story that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and go back and tell them that he's going to meet you in Galilee. How could they not have done that? They turn around and they're terrified. They turn around and they run away and they tell no one. And we're going, how? How? So today, as I said, we're looking at, we're winding up this sermon series on fear. So far we've looked about how fear can grasp us in the midst of the storms of our lives. We've looked at shame and how shame fosters fear because it tells us that we aren't worthy of love. We've looked at fear and how it creates and protects ourselves when we're committing character assassination. Basically, we're talking about people, talking crap about people because we're feeling threatened about them. And so if we talk badly about them, we can push them down and push ourselves up. And then sometimes that can really become lethal when we talk so bad about people that people think they are less than, or we think they are less than. And so then they become less than in our society, and people are willing to harm them. Sometimes we become willing to harm them. Mark is a good book for fear. It's a good book to read about fear. There are, first of all, only 16 chapters in the book of Mark, so if you're looking for a short book to read, that's one to go to. Doesn't take you that long. But 8 of the 16 chapters in the book of Mark have something to do with fear. 8 of the 16 chapters have the word fear, afraid, or terrified in them. They're dealing with fear. Mark is all about fear. And then it ends with the resurrection. And this story where the women are so terrified, they're terrified by the resurrection of Jesus that they turn around and they run and they tell no one. The resurrection. Well, it's hard stuff. The women had to let go of their expectations. Their expectations of what they knew to be real. They had to let go of everything that they expected that day. Everything that they held to be true. And in one instance, they had to let it go. And then they had to grasp hold of something that just couldn't possibly be true. And sometimes it's just too hard to do that. I've worked at Michael's a couple of different times, and I love working there, especially during what we call season, and that's the time from October through Christmas. And it's the time that people are really being creative, from Halloween costumes to getting ready for Christmas and moving through Christmas. And that's when I've worked there, because it's also a good time to make extra money for Christmas. And this one time I was working there, and this woman was there. Cute woman. And her clothes were just really super cute, had her hair in a cute hairstyle, makeup was just right. And on her arms, you could see the scars from cut marks. I don't know if you're familiar with cut marks, but there are many people who will cut themselves, and particularly women. And typically it's kind of ritualistic in that they're a lot of times the same size and the same distance from each other, and that's exactly what hers were. And they do this because of pain. Emotional pain that they're feeling. And if they could cause physical pain, it will take away that emotional pain. They can focus on that physical pain, and it helps them numb the emotional pain that they're feeling. So I could tell that this woman had had a lot of emotional pain in her life as I looked at both arms that had scars all the way up. And then I could also smell strong smell of alcohol coming from her. She was obviously quite inebriated. And then this young woman who was so cute and so dressed so cute. I mean, it wasn't like some woman in the gutter, you know, who had a lot of alcohol. She was just a cute woman, but she had her little daughter with her. And she was there, and they were looking for something crafty to do together. They were looking for something fun. And you could tell that this mom was trying. She was working really hard, in spite of whatever was hurting her and causing her pain, and whatever she was trying to numb with her alcohol. Because that's what many women especially do when they're drinking. They're trying to numb the pain. You could tell she was doing all she could. Alcoholics and addicts know the pain and fear well. Those in recovery can tell the story of it. They can tell the story of the pain. Years ago, I knew a man, we'll call him Tom. He had been 7 years sober. He had managed to get sober. And the way he tells the story is he was in a restaurant and he was going to go to the bathroom. He was going to the bathroom. He'd asked, "Where's the bathroom?" And they told him, "Oh, it was up the stairs and to the right." And he got up the stairs, and for some reason, he turned left instead of turning right. Left was into the bar. He said, "Can't tell you. I turned left instead of turning right." And he went to the bar. And he drank. You know, it's kind of interesting, these women and how they turned. They turned in fear. How many times is it that we in our own lives turn? We turn out of fear, out of terror. And that's what Tom did that day. He turned left instead of turning right. Alcoholics will say things like that they're not comfortable in their own skin. They're worried, they're scared, and they'll just say, I just can't handle being in my own skin. And so they would drink because it would numb out that feeling. They were afraid of life. In college, we would joke that some people couldn't dance at a party or whatever unless they had some liquid courage. Well, for alcoholics, sometimes that liquid courage is just needed there just to do life. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's the book that people follow when they're practicing sobriety, talks about fear. It says, fear, it is a short word that touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. Something about AA, Brené Brown, and the Gospel of Mark, something that they have in common is that grasping is hard to do. Grasping that fear is very hard to do. but it's necessary because that fear blocks us from what Brené Brown calls wholehearted living. It blocks us from living the lives that God intends for us. And it blocks us from living the resurrection. Throughout her book, Brené Brown talks about how early on in her research, she realized she wanted what wholehearted people had. What wholehearted people had. She calls wholehearted living a life of worthiness. Living a life without shame, and knowing that you are worthy, and how that life frees you up. And living that life is actually knowing your imperfections and making yourself vulnerable in those imperfections. And as she interviewed people in her work and in this research, she realized that she didn't have that, but she wanted it. And so she entered into therapy, and what all that caused was what she continually talks about in her book, breakdown. It caused a breakdown, but then she'll slash through in the type of breakdown and call it spiritual awakening. So for her it was a breakdown, spiritual awakening. And through this breakdown, spiritual awakening, she realized that her perfectionism, how she measured herself against others, were ways that she was trying to control her world, to control her fears. If she could be perfect, she could keep the world together. If she were perfect, then the gremlins of her fears would not take over her life. But in reality, all these ways that she was trying to be perfect were controlling her. Because the more she was trying to be perfect, the more she measured herself against anyone and everyone around her, or even against how she imagined people would be thinking about her. They didn't even have to be people around her or people who really lived in the world. She could imagine anyone. And so she had to let these things go. She had to let them go. Her perfectionism, her ruler of how she measured herself. She had to grasp vulnerability. She had to grasp her imperfections. And this is how she became to live as a real person and to live wholeheartedly. And it was only then that we can, as we do this, not try to be our own gods. Because when we're trying to be perfect, when we are trying to be our rulers, that's when we're trying to be our ruler. We have to be able to admit our dependence. My friend Tom spent another 10 years drinking after he went out, after he turned left instead of turning right. But with God's help, he managed to turn once again and face sobriety. The steps of Alcoholics Anonymous provide a framework for living wholehearted and living the resurrection. And it all starts with giving up control over our lives and giving that control to God. Step one is we admitted we were powerless over our lives, and our lives are unmanageable. Step two is we came to believe that God is a power greater than ourselves, and that our God can restore us to sanity. Our God can give us wholehearted living, a life that God intends for us. And step 3 is that we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. We may ask ourselves about these women. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. They're there at the tomb. They're told that Jesus has been raised from the dead. And they're told that He's going to meet them in Galilee, just like He told them. And they're terrified by these words. They're afraid, and they turn and they run, and they tell no one. They could not face the unknown. They could not face the impossible. They could not give up control over everything that made sense and everything that held their lives together. This is how Mark ends his gospel. The last words. What could Mark possibly be saying to us? What could be the message? Perhaps, at least one thing to ponder is that the resurrection happens anyway. God doesn't need us in order to make the impossible real. God doesn't need us in order to open the gates of new life, the new gates of reconciliation, the gates of recreation. God is in control. God is in control. And no matter what we do, no matter what direction, left or right, no matter if we turn around and run, God has us. God's got us. God's got us. We can't do anything about it, no matter how hard we try. Even when we turn away, even when we're full of fear, even when we can't possibly comprehend how anyone would find us worthy, how God could possibly love us in our state of unworthiness. Even when we cannot see ourselves out of the darkness that we find ourselves in, God has us. Resurrection is the last word. Christ is victorious. Darkness